So Christians through the ages have lived through times like ours. They've experienced epidemics and pandemics before. And one I'm particularly mindful of happened in the 3rd century. And we're told the estimation from the historians would be that as many as 5,000 people a day in Rome were dying from what was possibly, the historians think it might have been an Ebola outbreak. But one of the things that happened in that time was that the non-Christians in Rome and in other parts of the Roman Empire, if they could afford to, they fled the city to get away from the disease. In their minds, they believed that this was a punishment from the gods, and they abandoned and left those who were suffering. But the Christians didn't. They stayed in Rome and in other similar cities, and they cared for those who were sick, many of whom got better as a result of, in some places, just some very basic kind of care. I guess the thing that strikes me about that moment and sort of the parallel to our own is the different responses that are possible. Obviously, there isn't too many people believing in deities in the way that the ancient Romans did, but there certainly could be a question among some people that somehow this was something that God has done. For the Christian, though, the response looks very different. It's a response of faith and of love. I think as I look at the scenario that we're in, as I see people's responses, I can see, if you like, an ethic of fear, where people are saying, let's protect ourselves, let's make sure that we're maintaining social distance because they're scared themselves. But I can also see an ethic of real care, that this is designed to be, and the reason why all these measures have been taken has been designed out of care for others. Both of those ethics, both of those motivations, if you like, can be operative. Both of them can be at work in people's lives and amongst different people. The ethic of care, we might call it even an ethic of benevolence, that means that we actually have this sense that it matters what happens to somebody else, even somebody that we've never met. We might call that an ethic of altruism or care, and for many people, many non-Christians, they'd say that's part of being a human being. But one of the lessons of that story from ancient Rome tells us, or one of the lessons we can learn from that is, that's not how people always saw it. The ethic of care that we see at work around the world at the moment, product of Christian faith, even if some of those who are professing it do not see it as such. What it is it's the ethic of self-giving love, the ethic of agape, that's been kind of removed from its Christian foundation. It's been removed from its basis in Christian faith. That plague that I was mentioning, there was a Roman emperor called Julian who had abandoned the Christian faith that Constantine and other emperors had adopted. And when a plague hit the empire again, he was actually grumbling and complaining of Jesus. So one of the things that strikes me in the care of those early Christians in those different plagues, those different experiences from the first centuries of Christianity, was that they were obviously not afraid of death in such a way that they were able to reach out and care for those in a time when they didn't understand how viruses and germs work. They reached out and cared for those, and not just the Christians, but they cared for others in the city as well. What motivated them? What's the clue? What is it that we can learn from them, and why is it that they were motivated in such a way that they didn't fear death but reached out, risking death themselves in order to care for others? I think there's a really important clue that comes from the gospel today, from the story of Lazarus. There are three kind of chief characters that I want to reflect upon here. The first one of those is actually the crowd. There's a crowd that have gathered around Martha and Mary to grieve by the time that Jesus gets there and Lazarus has died. And they're grieving, and their question, of course, is when they say, look, he opened the eyes of the blind man, surely he could have prevented Lazarus' death. What's interesting about that crowd is they don't believe in Jesus. What's significant, like, how is it that the blind man that we heard about last week, why is it that he was healed and why is it that Lazarus wasn't? It's a fair question, but notice that it comes from a position of people who haven't been here, my brother wouldn't have died, but I know that you have the power to make him well again. I know that's why. That could sound like a great affirmation of faith, and sometimes that's what it's interpreted as. But I think what's going on here for Martha is that while Martha believes, she'll confess that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, she doesn't fully understand what that means yet. In her mind, he's a miracle worker, he can do wondrous things, but she doesn't understand his deeper purpose, his real intentions here. She doesn't really understand who he is and what he's come to do. Mary looks a little different. She comes, and when she goes to Jesus, and we're told that she runs to him when Martha comes back to the house to tell her that he's coming. When she responds by running to Jesus and she falls at his feet. It's an attitude of devotion. It's an attitude of prayer. And she says the first part of what Martha says. She says, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Both of them know this because they know that wherever Jesus goes, resurrection happens. Wherever Jesus goes, life is present. And so that's in them. They know that Jesus can do these things. But notice she doesn't say, I know God listens to you and you can do amazing, wondrous stuff. She just says, if you'd been here, I know he wouldn't have died. Why? Because around you, everything comes to life. At that point, Mary starts to cry. We've got no indication in the story before this that she's been in tears. But we're told that she cries and the crowd of mourners around her are crying too. And Jesus' response at that point is, well, it could sound a little troubling. We're told that in the version that we've heard, the translation we've just heard, he has a cry of deep distress that came straight from the heart. The word there is also that he was so perturbed, maybe even angry. What's he angry about? It's that Mary, while she believes in Jesus, while she has faith in him, while she has that attitude of devotion and prayer, confidence in him, at this point she allows the grief of others, maybe the mores of the day, the social response of the day, and yes, her own grief, to bring her into a place where she is grieving and she can't see anymore what Jesus has come to do. She can't see what he's intending, what he's wanting for her. So, Mary's response is fuller, but she's lost perspective. She's been swayed by those who don't understand Jesus at all. So let's go back to the early Christians. You see, the early Christians get the benefit of the whole story. They know that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And not only this, but they also know that Jesus himself is risen. Unlike Lazarus, Jesus, after his resurrection, will never die again. Lazarus would have a second death, as it were. But Jesus, raised to glory, will never ever die. Died once for all, but never again. He's fully alive forever now. The early Christians knew this, and what they knew was that the spiritual life they had received, they knew that Jesus was the resurrection and is the resurrection and the life, and that meant that the spiritual life that they experienced, they knew was greater than physical death. It enabled them not to forget about this world, but it enabled them to love and to give life to others, even at the risk of physical death, because they knew that there was a spiritual life that had begun in them and that was greater than death, that had conquered and defeated and beaten death. That's what motivated those Christians. I could be wrong, I don't think that it wasn't that they weren't afraid, mortally speaking, but they knew that there was a risen life within them that would beat the grave because Jesus had beaten the grave, because Jesus has conquered death forever. So that brings me to us and to some practical implications for this. You know, one way of thinking about the social distancing that we're being asked to do is to think of it as a way in which we're being separated. And it could be that ethic of fear at work in us. But I want to suggest to you, and I really believe this, that the social distancing we're being asked to do is an act of love. that it's an act of solidarity with others, that it's about caring for and respecting and looking after others. It's the ethic of self-giving love that actually says this is not just about my protection, it's actually about protecting others, my family, those closest around me, but even the stranger that I've never met. I saw a University of Sydney study in the last couple of days that suggested that if 80% of Australians practice the social distancing measures that we've undertaken, then the coronavirus in this country could be under control by July. This is an act of solidarity, it's an act of love. It does not need to be motivated by fear. I'm really conscious at this time too that today especially you'd be feeling the sense of a loss of being able to come to Mass. There'd be a grief in your hearts about that. I want to suggest that while there is a very real sense in which you're not participating in the Eucharist as you normally would, it doesn't mean that the Eucharist isn't being offered. It doesn't mean that as a church we're not celebrating the Mass. Obviously, and I don't actually really mean the live stream when I'm talking about that. What I mean is that as priests we're offering the Mass still on behalf of the whole church, as we always do, and especially for you here at St Declan's. But secondly, we are still a Eucharistic people. When you practice love of others, that's at this moment, that's things like when you wash your hands, when you are patient with the kids when they're home and they're trying to learn, when you're being patient with mum and dad and you're realising that they've got to do some work from home as well, when we're actually enjoying each other's company, perhaps in new ways, when we're allowing ourselves to be considerate and careful of others, when we do have to go shopping, that we're making sure that we're looking after those that are serving us. For those who are doctors and healthcare professionals, people working in nursing homes, teachers, all those who can't actually leave their role and work from home, but they've got to keep working, especially on the front line of this disease. You're practicing the self-giving love of Jesus that is Eucharistic love. You see, when we gather for Eucharist, we gather in order to discover and receive the self-giving love of Jesus, so that we might practice the self-giving love of Jesus with and for others. I want to finish with Lazarus, who I barely mentioned in this homily. When Jesus raises him to new life, and as he walks out of the tomb, we're told that he's still wearing the grave clothes. He's still wearing the cloths that he'd been bound in as he'd been laid in the tomb. We who have been raised to new life with Jesus, we who have entered into a new spiritual life that knows then that physical death is not the end, that this spiritual life begins now but is greater than the grave. There's a chance that we might still be wearing the grave cloths. And I think the grave cloth that I'm most struck by here is the grave cloth of fear. Jesus doesn't want us to be afraid. And so the words of Jesus to Lazarus are the words of Jesus to you and to me this morning. And that is, Jesus would say, unbind him and let him go free. Unbind her and let her go free. Let's cast off the fear, because we know the risen life of Jesus. We know that the spiritual life he gives is greater than physical death.